A reading from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9, verses 28 to 45. Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met him. Just then, a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He is my only child." Suddenly, a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him and will scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon dashed him to the ground in convulsions. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And all were astounded at the greatness of God. While everyone was amazed at all that he was doing, he said to his disciples, "Let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into human hands." But they did not understand this saying. Its meaning was concealed from them so that they could not perceive it. And they were afraid to ask him about this saying. The Gospel of Christ. Second reading is from Psalm 36, verses 5 to 10. Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens, your faithfulness to the clouds. Your righteousness is like the mighty mountains. Your judgments are like the great deep. You save humans and animals alike, O Lord. How precious is your steadfast love, O God. All people may take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light we see light. O continue your steadfast love to those who know you, and your salvation to the upright of heart. The word of the Lord. Today is the last Sunday in the season of Epiphany. It is referred to as Transfiguration Sunday. Transfiguration means a complete change of form or appearance into something more spiritual. It is a metamorphosis, a change of substance by supernatural beings. The passage for this day, Luke 9, verses 28 to 45, revolves around the mountaintop experience of the disciples and Jesus. Peter, James, and John accompanied Jesus up the mountain for a time of prayer and retreat. It was a breather from the demands of the crowds who followed Jesus constantly. Earlier in chapter 9, Jesus asked his disciples who people thought that he was. They replied, "John the Baptist," while others said Elijah, and still others said an ancient prophet risen from the dead. Jesus then asked them who they thought he was. Without missing a beat, Peter said that Jesus was the Messiah of God. Messiah means anointed one. Peter has an inkling then of Jesus' identity because of his words and actions. Previously, Jesus had warned his followers for the first time of his impending suffering, death, and resurrection at the hands of the authorities in Jerusalem. It is in this context, while on the mountain, that the inner circle of disciples get a fuller glimpse into Jesus' identity. It was a communal epiphany for them because they heard and saw something spectacular. Not only did they see Jesus glow dazzling white and his face hidden by blinding light, but they saw Moses and Elijah in glory as well. Moses, the representative of the law, and Elijah, the representative of the prophets, in deep conversation with Jesus about what was going to happen in Jerusalem and his subsequent ascension. This must have been totally surreal for them to see these three gathered in a meeting. Peter, the impulsive one, who identified Jesus as the anointed one of God, heavy with sleep, though awake, and not sure what his eyes and ears were experiencing, blurts out that he and the other two could make a dwelling for each of them. Very humorous. By the time he finishes his sentence, Moses and Elijah are gone, and Jesus is standing alone amidst the cloud without the glow. Before his disciples could speak to him, they are enveloped by a cloud from which a voice said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." Peter, James, and John kept silent about the whole thing and did not talk about it even amongst themselves. They then went back down the mountain, and Jesus continued his healing ministry. He also told them for the second time that he would undergo suffering, death, and resurrection in Jerusalem. Is it any wonder that the disciples were confused? After all, they saw the kind of life-changing things he was doing, healing the sick, raising the dead, casting out demons. They had been sent out by him earlier to do the same thing and were successful. Yet he simultaneously spoke of suffering and dying and rising again after 3 days. They did not understand this paradox. I think we can relate to how the disciples were feeling about things. Even they wondered at times what it all meant, and they misunderstood Jesus and his foretelling of the crucifixion and resurrection. They did get a profound glimpse into his personhood and the majestic yet intimate presence of God, who loved not only his child deeply, but also the rest of humanity as well. Perhaps they had no words to describe what they were thinking and feeling. This happens when we get a glimpse of the divine in our lives, however fleeting. The experience is etched in our lives even though we cannot house it forever. It will be a touchstone for our spiritual life and a backbone for the times when we need uplifting. The season of Epiphany is also about light. In the Gospel of John, Jesus describes himself as the light of the world. In Matthew, Jesus calls his listeners and followers to be a light to the world. Let your light so shine before others that they may see your good works and glorify God. In Psalm 36, verse 9, which we heard earlier, the psalmist writes, "For with you is the fountain of life. In your light we see light." This is an interesting proclamation. What do we see in God's light? Do we see ourselves, others, and creation in the light that God sees us in? If we see light in God's light, we see things the way God sees things. We see people the way God sees them. We also see what the psalmist writes, that God's love and faithfulness extends as far as the eye can see and God's righteousness is as high and strong as a mountain. God's judgments are like the great deep, saving humans and animals alike. God provides refuge to people like a mother bird provides refuge in the shadow of her wings. People feast on God's abundance of food and drink. When we see through God's light, we see things more clearly and deeply. Next week, we move into the season of Lent, which will be a time for self-reflection and hearing about the journey of Jesus into Jerusalem toward the cross and empty tomb. Let us continue to see in God's light the way God sees. Amen.